is plummeting, investor confidence is shaky, and there's a long shadow hanging over the business environment in India. It's not an easy time to be the government's chief economic advisor and try and remain optimistic in the midst of all this gloom. Raghuram Rajan is with us. The finance ministry said a few days ago that they expected the rupee to course correct, and they thought that the worst was over. Clearly it was not. We now have the rupee closing at a historic low. At that time, the ministry had argued that they were not unduly alarmed. Are you alarmed now?
No, I think what you have to do is look at this in the context of what's happening in the rest of the world. What's happening is the US Federal Reserve is moving away from its policy of quantitative easing. What that means is every month it was putting in $85 billion into the bond markets.
Yeah.
Now it says at some point towards the end of the year it's going to stop doing that. Now what that means is interest rates in the United States are probably going to start moving up.
Yeah.
If interest rates in the United States move up, all the people who've been pouring their money into the emerging markets say, well, why not bring some of it back, because it's safer in the United States, we get a good yield, and so some of that money is leaving. That's causing problems across emerging markets.
Yeah.
You mentioned the rupee. If bond investors in India sell bonds and take their money out, they want dollars. That puts pressure on the rupee because they're selling their rupees to get dollars, and what that does is makes the dollar more expensive.
Let's put the reason aside for a moment because we can debate that. But the consequence, are you now alarmed? Would you use the word alarmed at this moment?
No, because to some extent what is happening is people are reacting to the news, the volatility created by the US announcement. What you have to look at is the rupee in a disequilibrium position? Is it at this point still overvalued so it can plunge a long way? When you look at the rupee in terms of its competitiveness, look over a long horizon, technically speaking, at this point it is undervalued. In other words, if you look at the real effective exchange rate, that's what economists use to see whether it's worth the right amount, you see that the rupee actually has gone below the real effective exchange rate that it should be at. So as a result, the sense is, yes, this will correct. Now, when exactly it correct, and I'm not the person who said, this, we have
No,
reached
you
the
didn't
bottom,
say that. You didn't
so
say
on.
that. But
it will course, the rupee will find its equilibrium.
how much worse do you think it'll get before it gets better?
We don't know. I mean, that depends on the mood of investors. And, you've heard the term irrational exuberance. You could also use the term irrational pessimism. So until that irrationality to some extent evaporates, until the overshooting, people sort of think, I better get out before the next guy gets out. At some point they say this has gone too far. Now it's so lucrative to put in money, and then you see the pushback, which can be quite sudden. So the point is, I don't know when that is going to take place, but in terms of fundamentals, the rupee has gone below the value it should be at.
That's interesting that you should say that, because there have been arguments that the rupee actually needs to plummet further to reach its natural level, that it has actually been overvalued. There have been economists who suggested that its natural level would be about 70 rupees to the US dollar.
I'm not one of those.
You clearly are not, but that has been the argument, that it is being held up artificially.
So what are the arguments for the rupee being lower that people advance? One, because we are running a large current account deficit, somehow if we have a low rupee, we're going to start exporting much more, and that will narrow the current account deficit. Now, that is true to some extent, but this is why I said we have to look at the competitiveness of the rupee, and right now we are very competitive relative to the historic past. The real problem why our exports are not picking up is because our partner countries are pretty much dead in the water. I mean, we're talking about the Indian economy being bad at 5% growth. We have a ton of industrial economies coasting along at 0, but we have countries like Brazil, 1.5%. We have Russia, 2.5%. Turkey. All these countries have problems. So the point is, across the world, it's difficult to export. However, we need to import because we've got oil as imports, we've got coal as imports. Of course, we have gold, which has come off in this last month considerably.
But talking about gold, isn't it a bit irrational, to borrow a word from you, to expect people who actually buy gold, because traditional wisdom has it that it's the one thing that guards against inflation? The inflation is not the citizen's fault. The inflation is a consequence of either, whether you say global phenomenon or somebody else says the government's policies or lack of reform, there is inflation. and the citizen buys gold to guard against that inflation. Now, when you have missives coming from the governments imploring people not to buy gold, isn't that a bit unreasonable? Because people are basically doing what they think they can to create some sort of safe haven for themselves.
Absolutely, that's right. I think the finance minister in making that statement was trying to tell people to also take into account the fact that every time they buy gold, it also means that in some sense we are buying dollars. Which
True,
is why the dollars.
But aren't you asking people to pay for economic policies that haven't
I mean,
worked, or the lack of success with containing inflation?
I'm not so sure that it's. I mean, they're not part of the answer. I mean, the people of the country are part of the answer, but the point is well taken, and that is precisely why we haven't taken harsher measures against gold, because there are a lot of people who are buying it for economic reasons.
Yeah.
And what we have to do, and this is a point we have emphasized again and again, we have to create alternative investment opportunities for them which pay them an adequate return.